Pa? Is it true? Was Ma really taken? Why didn't you tell me?
Some women leave a town quietly. Others leave a scar that follows a man for the rest of his life. Elias Mercer learned the difference on a cold autumn night in Wyoming Territory, back when the wind smelled like cedar smoke and rain drifted low across the prairie like ghosts searching for somewhere to rest. The lonely cowboy had spent 3 years riding from ranch to ranch without staying long enough for anyone to remember his face. He slept under open skies, drank alone, and trusted horses more than people. Men in Blackwater Creek called him polite but distant. Women called him impossible to know. Elias preferred it that way, because loneliness was easier to carry than grief. That night, the saloon lamps flickered gold against the storm clouds rolling over the mountains. Rain tapped softly against the windows while a tired piano struggled through an old frontier hymn in the corner. Elias sat alone near the back wall, hat low over his eyes, nursing black coffee gone cold an hour earlier. Then the door opened. Every conversation inside the saloon seemed to slow without anyone realizing why. She stepped in wearing a dark traveling coat dusted with rain, her gloved hand gripping the doorframe for half a second like she'd ridden hard to get there. She wasn't dressed like the women from cattle towns. Too elegant, too composed. But her green eyes carried the same exhaustion Elias had seen in drifters crossing the plains before winter. The room stared. She ignored all of them except him. "Is this seat taken?" she asked softly. Elias looked around at the dozens of empty chairs in the saloon. "Plenty of others," he answered. A faint smile touched her lips. "I know." Then she sat anyway. Up close, she smelled faintly of lavender and wet leather. Her chestnut hair had loosened from the wind, soft strands catching the lantern glow beside them. Elias noticed her hands first. Not delicate, strong hands. Hands that had held reins for miles. But there was something nervous beneath her calm, like she was listening for danger even in silence. "You always drink coffee in a saloon?" she asked. "Keeps my head clear. Maybe tonight your head deserves a little mercy." She ordered. Whiskey but barely touched it. Outside, thunder rolled across the prairie, deep and distant. The storm wasn't leaving anytime soon. Neither was she. Hours passed strangely after that. Easy, quiet. Like two strangers pretending they'd met years earlier and simply forgotten. She told him her name was Vivian Hale. Said she came from back east. Said she hated cities because nobody looked at the stars anymore. Elias didn't ask many questions. Cowboys learned long ago that lonely people usually carried reasons for being lonely. Near midnight, the saloon owners started blowing out lanterns one by one. Chairs scraped against wood floors. Men stumbled into the rain toward home. But Vivian stayed beside him near the dying firelight, watching sparks rise from the stone hearth. "You ever get tired of riding alone?" she asked quietly. Elias stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. "Every day." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something inside the room changed. Something soft, dangerous in its own way. Outside, rain hammered harder against the roof while prairie wind howled through the empty streets of Blackwater Creek. Vivian slowly reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small silver pendant shaped like a star. She pressed it gently into his hand. "If I asked you for one night," she whispered, "would you remember me after sunrise?" The strange thing about certain nights in the Old West was how they could feel endless while disappearing faster than smoke in the wind. Elias Mercer realized that sometime after midnight, while sitting beside Vivian Hale in the tiny room above the saloon, listening to rain slide across the window glass in silver streams. The storm had swallowed Blackwater Creek whole by then. No hoofbeats, no voices, just prairie thunder rolling far beyond the hills and the soft crackle of lantern light between them. Vivian sat near the bed with her boots off, warming her hands around a tin cup of coffee gone lukewarm. Her traveling coat hung beside the door, dripping rainwater onto the wooden floorboards. Elias leaned against the wall near the window, arms folded, hat resting beside him. Neither of them seemed eager to sleep. "You always this quiet?" she asked gently. Elias shrugged once. Talking never fixed much. She smiled faintly at that, but sadness lingered beneath it. He could see it every time the firelight touched her face. Whatever road she had ridden before reaching Blackwater Creek had left more than dust behind. "And running?" he asked after a while. Does that fix things? Vivian lowered her eyes to the cup in her hands. The silence stretched long enough for rain to fill it. Sometimes running is the only thing keeping a person alive. Elias studied her carefully then. Most people lied with their mouths. Lonely people lied with their eyes. But hers carried something heavier than deception. Fear maybe. Or grief worn too long. She looked up suddenly, catching him staring. You are wondering who I am. Everybody is somebody different out here. That is not an answer. Neither was yours. For the first time that night, Vivian laughed softly. Real laughter. Tired but warm enough to loosen something inside his chest he had forgotten existed. Outside, wind rattled the sign hanging over the saloon downstairs. The storm was growing worse. She moved toward the window slowly, standing beside him close enough for him to smell rain and lavender again. You ever think about leaving all this behind? She asked quietly. Elias glanced toward the dark prairie beyond the glass. Leaving to where? Anywhere people do not know your name. That sounds lonely. Maybe loneliness feels safer once you get used to it. Those words stayed with him because they sounded too much like his own thoughts spoken back to him by someone else. For a moment, neither moved. The lantern beside the bed flickered low, throwing gold shadows across the room. Vivian reached into her coat pocket again and unfolded a small piece of paper worn soft at the corners. Elias noticed elegant handwriting across it before she folded it shut quickly. Bad news? He asked. Her fingers tightened slightly around the letter. The kind that follows you. Another silence. But this one felt different. Closer somehow. Like two strangers standing at the edge of a cliff neither intended to approach. Then she looked at him. With an expression so honest it almost hurt to witness. You ever meet someone and know they arrived at the wrong time? Elias frowned faintly. Maybe timing is all anybody gets. Vivian stepped closer until only inches remained between them. The silver star pendant still rested in his palm, where she had left it downstairs earlier that night. Her eyes dropped toward it briefly before returning to his face. Keep it, she whispered. Why? Because tomorrow morning I need somebody in this world to remember I existed. The storm outside seemed to stop breathing for a second. Elias could hear the old clock downstairs ticking through the floorboards. He had met dozens of women across frontier towns from Montana to New Mexico. Some kind, some forgettable, but none had ever looked at him the way Vivian Hale did then. Not like a cowboy passing through town, not like a drifter, like a man standing in the exact place fate intended. Slowly, carefully, Elias reached for her hand. Her fingers trembled slightly against his rough, calloused palm. And for the first time in years, the lonely cowboy stopped feeling alone. But sometime before dawn, while gray morning light crept across the prairie outside, Elias woke to silence. The fire had died. Rain had stopped. And Vivian Hale was gone. Some people disappear from your life, slowly like smoke fading over a campfire. Others vanish all at once and leave silence behind loud enough to haunt a man for years. Elias Mercer stood alone in the small upstairs room, while pale morning light stretched across the floorboards where Vivian Hale had been only hours earlier. The coffee cups still sat beside the cold lantern. Her traveling coat was gone. So were the soft traces of lavender that had filled the room during the storm. All she left behind was emptiness and the silver pendant resting heavy in his hand. Elias searched Blackwater Creek until sundown that day. He checked the stables first. The stable boy swore a woman had ridden east before sunrise on a dark horse moving fast enough to throw dust half a mile behind her. Nobody knew where she came from. Nobody knew where she went. The saloon owner remembered only her green eyes and the way. She kept glancing toward the window like someone afraid of being followed. Elias rode 20 miles east before nightfall, then 30 more the next morning. Every small frontier town looked the same after a while. Wooden churches, dry wells, children running through dirt roads while tired men leaned against feed stores pretending life had not worn them thin. He showed people the silver pendant. Most shook their heads. Some barely looked at it at all. One old woman in Casper finally studied the star carefully beneath a porch lantern and frowned. That silver work is expensive, she muttered. Not ranch money. East Coast money. Elias asked if she knew the name Vivian Hale. The woman laughed softly without humor. That sounds like the kind of name rich people invent when they do not want the truth following them. Those words stayed with him longer than he expected. Winter came early that year. Snow drifted across Wyoming plains in long white sheets while Elias continued riding town to town chasing a woman he barely knew. Men called him foolish. One rancher near Cheyenne asked if she had stolen from him. Elias stared into his whiskey for a long moment before answering quietly. No. Worse. What is worse than theft? Elias closed his fingers around the silver pendant in his pocket. Being remembered. Months passed. Then more. Eventually, even lonely men grew tired of chasing ghosts across frozen territory. Elias stopped searching in the spring after his horse nearly collapsed outside Laramie from exhaustion. He rented work on a struggling cattle ranch north of the mountains and tried convincing himself life would settle back into something ordinary again. But ordinary became difficult after certain nights, especially the quiet ones. Every storm reminded him of Blackwater Creek. Every woman with chestnut hair made him glance twice. Sometimes he woke before dawn convinced he could still smell lavender and rain lingering somewhere beside him. He never married, never stayed anywhere longer than necessary. The years rolled westward slowly beneath endless skies. 7 winters, 7 lonely summers. Elias grew older in the way frontier men often did. Quietly, his shoulders broadened from ranch work. Thin scars appeared across his hands from rope burns and barbed wire. Gray touched the edges of his dark hair near his temples. But the strangest thing was this. No matter how many miles he rode or how many towns faded behind him, he never stopped carrying the silver pendant. Then one dusty afternoon in late September, everything changed. Elias had ridden into the small rail town of Dry Creek to deliver cattle contracts for his employer. The streets smelled of coal smoke and dry hay beneath the afternoon heat. Railroad whistles echoed across the valley while merchants shouted prices beneath striped canvas awnings. Elias barely noticed any of it until he stepped outside the general store and saw a black carriage stopping near the bank across the street. Rich people rarely traveled through towns like Dry Creek unless money followed close behind them. A driver climbed down first. Then a woman stepped carefully from the carriage wearing a dark green dress trimmed with black velvet. Elegant, composed, untouchable. Elias froze before his mind even understood why. Because hanging from the neck of the little boy beside her, glinting beneath golden sunlight, was a silver star pendant he would have recognized anywhere in the world. There are moments in a man's life when the world seems to stop moving around him. Elias Mercer felt one standing in the middle of Dry Creek with wagon wheels rattling somewhere far behind him and railroad smoke drifting across the afternoon sky like a slow storm. The little boy beside the woman could not have been older than 7. Dark brown hair, calm gray-blue eyes. The kind of eyes Elias had stared at in cracked mirrors above wash basins for most of his life. But it was the silver pendant hanging against the child's vest that turned his blood cold beneath the Wyoming heat. Vivian saw him a second later. Her hand tightened instantly around the boy's shoulder. For one brief moment, the elegant composure she carried like armor disappeared completely. Elias remembered that expression. He had seen it once before in Blackwater Creek on the night she admitted some people only survived by running. The crowd along the street kept moving around them without noticing anything had changed. Horses passed. Store doors opened and closed. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith hammered iron in steady rhythm. But for Elias, all sound seemed trapped behind glass. Vivian looked different now. Richer. Harder somehow. Her chestnut hair was pinned neatly beneath a dark green hat, and expensive gloves covered the hands he once remembered wrapped around a warm coffee cup beside a storm-lit window. But her eyes had not changed. Those same green eyes still carried exhaustion hidden beneath grace. The boy looked curiously between them. "Mama," he asked softly. Vivian never looked away from Elias. "Stay close to me, Oliver." The child obeyed immediately, though his small fingers tightened around the silver pendant resting against his chest. Elias could not breathe properly for a second. Oliver. Even the name hurt in ways he could not explain. Slowly, he stepped forward through the dust-covered street. Vivian. Her expression barely moved. I wondered how long it would take before fate grew cruel again. Elias stopped a few feet away. 7 years vanished and returned all at once beneath the dry September wind. "You disappeared," he said quietly. Vivian gave the faintest shake of her head. "No, Elias. I left." The difference between those two words settled heavily between them. Elias glanced down at the boy. Oliver stared back without fear, studying him with the careful curiosity children reserved for strangers who somehow felt familiar. "That pendant," Elias said softly. Vivian immediately covered it with her gloved hand. Too late. He had already seen it. A stagecoach rolled past behind them, wheels grinding against dirt and gravel. Vivian lowered her voice carefully. "This is not the place." "Then tell me where the place is." Pain flickered across her face so quickly most men would have missed it. Elias did not. "You should not have come here." "I did not know you were here." "Exactly." Before Elias could answer, the heavy wooden doors of the Dry Creek Bank opened behind Vivian. 3 well-dressed men stepped outside, laughing quietly among themselves before stopping at the sight of her. The tallest one adjusted his gray vest and removed his hat politely. "Mrs. Whitmore," he greeted warmly. "Your documents will be ready by tomorrow afternoon." "Mrs. Whitmore." Elias felt the words like cold rain down his spine. Vivian nodded with practiced calm. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan." The banker finally noticed Elias standing there. His smile faded slightly, as wealthy men often did around cowboys wearing trail dust and worn boots. "Friend of yours?" he asked carefully. Vivian hesitated half a second too long. "An old acquaintance." Something unreadable crossed the banker's face then. Pity maybe, or understanding. He tipped his hat politely and stepped away with the others toward the hotel across the street. Silence returned once they were gone. Elias stared at Vivian. "Whitmore." Her eyes dropped briefly toward Oliver. "Things changed after Blackwater Creek." "Looks like more than things changed." She inhaled slowly, steadying herself beneath the weight of his voice. Then Oliver tugged gently on her sleeve. "Mama," he whispered, "who is he?" Vivian closed her eyes for the smallest moment before answering. "Someone I once knew during a storm." But the little boy kept staring at Elias with those same gray-blue eyes, and somewhere deep inside his chest, the lonely cowboy began realizing the storm had never really ended at all. The hardest truths in the Old West were usually spoken quietly, not because they hurt less, but because pain carried farther when whispered. Elias Mercer stood motionless in the middle of Dry Creek, while wagon dust drifted slowly between him and Vivian Whitmore beneath the fading afternoon sun. 7 years earlier, she had disappeared before sunrise and left him with nothing except a silver pendant and questions that never stopped following him across the frontier. Now she stood 10 feet away wearing another man's last name, while a little boy with his eyes held tightly to her side. The strange thing was not the anger growing inside him. It was the grief. Vivian adjusted her gloves carefully like a woman trying to hold herself together through simple movements. "Oliver," she said softly, "wait for me inside the carriage." The boy looked reluctant. His curious gaze remained fixed on Elias for another second before he obeyed and climbed quietly back inside. Once the carriage door closed, the noise of Dry Creek seemed distant again. Vivian finally looked at Elias fully, and for the first time since Blackwater Creek, he saw exhaustion breaking through her carefully polished composure. "You should not stay here," she whispered. Elias gave a faint bitter smile. "Funny thing. 7 years ago you said almost the same thing before vanishing." Pain flickered across her face. "Do not do this in the middle of the street." "Then where?" "Nowhere." The answer landed harder than shouting would have. A train whistle echoed through the valley somewhere beyond town, long and lonely beneath the Wyoming sky. Elias studied her silently for a moment. Rich dress, expensive carriage, gold wedding band no longer on her hand. Everything about Vivian Whitmore looked untouchable now except her eyes. Those still looked tired enough to break a man's heart. "Is he mine?" Elias asked quietly. Vivian closed her eyes. Just for a second. But it was enough. The world around him seemed to narrow into silence. She opened her eyes again slowly, and there it was. The truth neither of them could outrun anymore. "You do not get to ask that after disappearing for 7 years." Elias stared at her in disbelief. "I disappeared?" Her voice sharpened for the first time. "I waited for you." The wind pushed strands of chestnut hair loose against her cheeks, while people passed nearby pretending not to notice the tension hanging between them. "I wrote letters," she continued softly. 6 of them. Elias frowned. "I never saw any letters. Because my father made certain you never would." The words struck harder than he expected. Vivian looked away toward the distant railroad tracks cutting through Dry Creek like scars across the land. "After Blackwater Creek, he found me before sunrise. He knew exactly where I had gone. Her voice trembled slightly beneath the calm surface she fought to maintain. My family owned rail interests back east. Political connections. Land contracts. Men like my father did not allow their daughters to disappear with cowboys. Elias felt something cold settle inside his chest. So he forced you to marry Whitmore. Vivian shook her head slowly. No. Life did. The answer carried years inside it. Charles Whitmore was kind to me. Older. Wealthy. Dying long before I married him, though nobody knew it except the doctors. She glanced toward the carriage where Oliver waited quietly behind the curtains. He gave my son a name when society would not. Elias lowered his eyes briefly toward the dirt road beneath his boots. Suddenly, every lonely year felt heavier. You could have told me. Vivian laughed softly then, but there was no warmth in it. And say what exactly? That I loved a cowboy I met during one storm, while carrying another man's last name before the world even knew. Elias looked back at her. I would have stayed. That finally broke something behind her eyes. No, Elias, she whispered painfully. You would have tried. Silence swallowed them again. Somewhere nearby, church bells rang the late afternoon hour. Vivian stepped closer then, lowering her voice carefully. Charles died 2 years ago. Since then, every banker, railroad investor, and land broker west of Denver has been waiting to see if I fail. Elias noticed then how tightly she held herself, like someone carrying weight alone too long. And now you appear out of nowhere. Her green eyes lifted toward his. Do you have any idea what that does to a woman who spent 7 years teaching herself not to hope? By the time the sun disappeared behind the Dry Creek Hills, rumors had already started spreading through town like wildfire moving through prairie grass. Frontier towns survived on 3 things more than anything else: dust, whiskey, gossip, and people noticed when a wealthy widow stood trembling in the street beside a cowboy who looked at her like unfinished history. Elias Mercer spent the evening alone outside the livery stable brushing down his horse, while lantern light flickered softly across the empty road. The sky above Wyoming had turned dark blue, deep enough to swallow stars whole. But his thoughts remained trapped on Vivian Whitmore and the look in her eyes when she asked if he understood what hope could do to a woman forced to survive without it. He barely heard the footsteps approaching until an older stable hand stopped beside him, chewing tobacco slowly beneath a weathered gray mustache. Town talks fast, the man muttered. Elias kept brushing dust from the saddle. Towns always do. The stable hand glanced toward the Grand Hotel across the street, where warm yellow light glowed through expensive curtains. Railroad men arrived from Denver this morning. Been circling Mrs. Whitmore for months now. Elias finally looked up. Circling her for what? The old man spit into the dirt. Land. One word. Heavy enough to explain everything. Her late husband owned nearly 12,000 acres west of Dry Creek. Good water. Grazing valleys. Railroad routes pushing this direction now. He lowered his voice slightly. Men with money smell weakness faster than wolves smell blood. Elias frowned faintly. Vivian does not seem weak. No, the old man admitted. That is why they have not beaten her yet. The words settled hard in the cooling night air. A few minutes later, Elias crossed the street toward the hotel with dust still clinging to his boots. The lobby smelled of polished wood, cigar smoke, and expensive perfume from travelers wealthy enough to treat frontier towns like temporary inconveniences. Men in tailored coats sat near the fireplace, discussing rail contracts and cattle futures beneath crystal chandeliers shipped all the way from St. Louis. Elias immediately looked out of place among them. He did not care. Vivian sat alone near the far corner reading documents beneath a brass lamp, while Oliver slept curled beside her on a velvet sofa, his small boots still dusty from the road. For a moment Elias simply stood there watching them quietly. The sight hurt more than loneliness ever had. Vivian noticed him first. Her expression tightened almost instantly. You should not be here. Elias ignored the warning and approached slowly. Who is trying to take your land? Vivian closed the papers in front of her. That is none of your concern anymore. You made it my concern the moment I saw that boy wearing my pendant. A few nearby businessmen glanced toward them, briefly before returning to their drinks. Vivian lowered her voice sharply. Do not speak like that here. Elias leaned closer. Then tell me the truth somewhere else. For a second, she looked exhausted enough to surrender. Then the walls returned behind her eyes. You cannot fix this. You do not know what I can fix. No, Elias. Her voice softened painfully. I know exactly what kind of man you are. That is the problem. Before he could answer, a shadow fell across the table beside them. Elias looked up to find the tall banker from earlier standing there with a thin smile and silver cufflinks glinting beneath the hotel lamps. Mrs. Whitmore, he greeted politely. Mr. Callahan, she answered carefully. The banker glanced toward Elias with obvious disapproval. I hope this gentleman is not troubling you. Vivian hesitated again. Too long. Callahan noticed. Men like him always noticed weakness hiding beneath silence. Actually, Elias said calmly before she could answer. We were discussing business. Callahan raised one eyebrow. Is that so? Depends, Elias replied. How much land are railroad men trying to steal these days? The banker's smile faded slightly. Careful, cowboy. Wealthy men dislike accusations. Elias met his gaze without blinking. Good thing I dislike wealthy men. Tension settled across the hotel lobby immediately. Even the piano player near the fireplace slowed his music. Callahan straightened his vest calmly, but something colder moved behind his eyes now. Mrs. Whitmore, he said smoothly, you should remember that public appearances matter in towns like this, especially for widows raising children alone. Vivian stiffened beside the sleeping boy. Elias saw it instantly. The quiet insult hidden beneath polished manners. Callahan tipped his hat once and walked away toward the dining room. Silence followed him like smoke. Vivian slowly looked toward Elias afterward. Fear and frustration tangled together beneath her calm expression. You should have let him walk away. Elias glanced toward Oliver sleeping peacefully beneath the hotel lamp, then back toward the railroad men gathering near the dining hall. Too late, he said quietly. I think they already know I am staying. Men like Elias Mercer understood horses better than people because horses never hid what frightened them. People did, especially the ones carrying heartbreak behind polite smiles and expensive clothing. The next morning, Dry Creek woke beneath a cold silver fog rolling low through the valley while church bells echoed softly across town. Elias had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Oliver standing beside the carriage with that silver pendant resting against his small chest like a memory refusing to stay buried. By sunrise, he was already outside the Whitmore property west of town. The ranch sat nearly a mile beyond Dry Creek on rising land overlooking the river basin below. White fencing stretched across golden prairie grass, and smoke drifted peacefully from the large ranch house chimney into the pale morning sky. Wealth surrounded the place, but something about it still felt lonely. Maybe because loneliness always left fingerprints behind if a man looked carefully enough. Elias dismounted near the barn and tied his horse quietly. Before he reached the porch, he heard laughter. Small. Genuine. It stopped him cold. Oliver stood near the corral struggling to guide a stubborn pony in circles with a rope nearly dragging through the dirt behind him. The boy's cheeks were red from the morning chill, and frustration darkened his little face every time the pony ignored him completely. You are holding the rope too tight, Elias called calmly. Oliver spun around immediately, startled. For a second, the boy looked ready to run back toward the house. Then curiosity won instead. Mama says strangers should not walk onto ranches uninvited. Elias nodded once. Your mama is smart. Oliver studied him carefully beneath the gray morning light. Then why are you here? Elias glanced toward the pony. Because that horse is about 3 seconds away from embarrassing you permanently. The boy frowned seriously before looking back toward the animal tugging against the rope again. He does not listen. Elias walked closer slowly, careful not to crowd him. Horses listen when they trust your hands. Oliver looked unconvinced. How do you make them trust you? Elias crouched beside him, adjusting the rope gently through the child's small fingers. You stop fighting them. Together they guided the pony in a slow circle through the frosted grass. This time the animal followed without resistance. Oliver's eyes widened slightly. How did you do that? Elias smiled faintly. I asked instead of forcing. The boy considered those words with surprising seriousness for someone his age. Then, quietly, he asked, Did you know my mama before my father died? The question hit harder than Elias expected. He kept his eyes on the horse while answering carefully. A long time ago. Oliver nodded slowly. She never smiles much anymore. Wind moved softly through the prairie around them. Somewhere beyond the hills, cattle lowed in the distance. Elias looked toward the ranch house where curtains shifted briefly behind an upstairs window. Vivian was watching them. He could feel it. Your mama has been carrying too much by herself, Elias said softly. Oliver kicked lightly at the dirt. The railroad men keep coming. Elias frowned. What do they want? Mama says they want the land near the river because trains are coming west. The boy lowered his voice slightly. Last week I heard Mr. Callahan say women should not own ranches alone. Something cold moved through Elias then. Not anger exactly. Something quieter. More dangerous. The kind of feeling frontier men carried when they finally stopped running from things that mattered. Before he could speak again, the front door opened behind them. Vivian stepped onto the porch wearing a dark blue dress and a long wool shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders against the cold. Her expression tightened the moment she saw Elias beside Oliver near the corral. Oliver, she called gently, go inside for breakfast. The boy hesitated. But Mr. Mercer was teaching me. Inside, she repeated softly. Oliver obeyed immediately, though he glanced back once toward Elias before disappearing through the front door. Silence settled across the ranch afterward. Vivian walked slowly toward the corral, boots brushing through frosted prairie grass. Up close, exhaustion lined her face beneath the morning light. You should not get attached to him, she whispered. Elias looked toward the house where Oliver had vanished. Little late for that. Vivian closed her eyes briefly, as though the words physically hurt. Elias, please. He turned toward her fully then, calm and steady beneath the cold Wyoming sky. I am done leaving people behind. Something fragile moved across her expression at that. Not trust. Not yet. But maybe the beginning of remembering what safety once felt like before life taught her to fear it. The wind changed 3 days later. Old ranchers used to say you could feel trouble arriving across the frontier long before you ever saw it. The horses grew restless first. Then the sky turned strange. Then silence settled over the land in a way that made even birds disappear from the fences. Elias Mercer noticed all three before sunset. He stood beside the Whitmore barn repairing a loose gate hinge while Oliver handed him nails one by one from a small tin bucket. The boy had followed him constantly since that first morning near the corral. Not loudly, not desperately, just quietly enough to feel dangerous to a man who had spent years convincing himself he belonged nowhere. Mama says winter will come early this year, Oliver said while kicking dust across the barn floor. Elias hammered another nail carefully into the wood. Your mama is probably right. Oliver studied him thoughtfully for a moment. You always talk like that. Elias glanced sideways. Like what? Like somebody who knows storms before they happen. The question almost made him smile. Almost. Before he could answer, hoofbeats echoed across the prairie outside the ranch. Fast. Too fast for travelers. Oliver immediately looked toward the open barn doors while Elias straightened slowly beside the gate. 3 riders approached through the fading gold light, carrying railroad company markings on their coats. Elias recognized the lead rider instantly. Mr. Callahan. The banker dismounted smoothly near the porch where Vivian stood waiting beneath the evening wind with her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Even from a distance, Elias could see tension settle across her face the moment she saw the men arrive. Oliver moved closer beside him. Mama hates when they come here. Elias wiped dust from his hands slowly, eyes fixed on the house. Stay inside the barn. But, Oliver. Something in Elias's voice made the boy obey immediately this time. The child retreated deeper into the barn shadows while Elias walked toward the ranch house beneath a sky slowly darkening above the valley. By the time he reached the porch, Callahan was already unfolding papers across the railing, while Vivian stood perfectly still listening with exhausted silence. Mrs. Whitmore, the banker said smoothly, the Railroad Council has made its position very clear. Without partnership agreements, maintaining 12,000 acres through winter will become financially unrealistic. Vivian's voice remained calm. You mean impossible after your investors finish squeezing every bank west of Denver into refusing my credit lines? Callahan smiled faintly. Business is rarely personal. Elias stepped onto the porch then. Funny. Looks personal from where I stand. The banker's expression cooled immediately. Mr. Mercer. Mr. Callahan. Wind moved hard through the prairie grass around them, carrying the sharp scent of rain somewhere far beyond the hills. Vivian looked between both men with quiet frustration already building behind her eyes. This is not helping. Actually, Callahan replied softly, never looking away from Elias. It helps considerably. Towns notice things. A wealthy widow allowing strange cowboys to linger around her property. People ask questions. Elias took one slow step closer. Then maybe people should mind their own business. Society does not work that way. Callahan folded the documents neatly before continuing, especially when inheritance and legitimacy become delicate subjects. Vivian stiffened instantly beside the porch railing. Elias saw it. So did Callahan. The banker lowered his voice carefully, almost politely. You have done admirable work maintaining appearances these past years, Mrs. Whitmore. But appearances become fragile once rumors begin. Silence hit harder than shouting ever could. Somewhere, behind the house, thunder rolled softly across distant mountains. Vivian finally spoke, her voice quieter now. Leave. Callahan adjusted his gloves calmly. I only came to offer one final partnership before winter. He glanced briefly toward Elias. Men like him cannot protect land from railroads. Elias met his eyes without blinking. Maybe not, but I can protect people. Something dangerous flickered behind Callahan's polished smile then. Not fear. Calculation. Careful, cowboy. Some fights destroy everything attached to them. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode off with the others disappearing slowly into gathering twilight. The moment they vanished beyond the ridge, Vivian exhaled sharply like she had been holding her breath for years. Rain began falling lightly against the porch roof above them. Elias looked toward her carefully. What did he mean about inheritance? Vivian stayed silent too long. Then finally, she whispered something that made the cold prairie air suddenly feel much heavier around them both. Charles Whitmore's brothers are contesting Oliver's claim to the ranch. Elias frowned. Because they think he is not Charles's son. Vivian looked at him, then with tired green eyes full of fear she had hidden from the entire world for 7 long years. Because deep down, she whispered painfully, they know he is yours. The first snow arrived 2 weeks later, soft and silent across the Wyoming prairie, covering fence posts and wagon trails like the land itself was trying to forget every hard thing that had happened there before. But some stories refused to disappear beneath winter. Elias Mercer stood outside the Whitmore barn before sunrise, pulling fresh water from the frozen well, while pale morning light slowly climbed over the distant hills. The ranch was quiet except for horses shifting inside their stalls and smoke curling gently from the house chimney into the cold blue sky. Strange how quickly a lonely place could begin feeling like home once somebody waited for you inside it. He heard the screen door creak behind him and turned to find Oliver stepping carefully through the snow, wearing a coat too large for his small shoulders. The boy held something tightly in both hands. Mama said you forgot this, he said softly, holding out the silver star pendant. Elias stared at it for a long moment before taking it carefully from the child's mitten-covered hand. The metal felt warm despite the cold. Your mama should keep it, Elias answered quietly. Oliver shook his head. She said it belonged to you long before it belonged to me. Snow drifted softly around them, while the boy studied him with those same gray-blue eyes that still startled Elias every time he saw them. Are you leaving? Oliver finally asked. The question hit harder than the winter wind. Elias looked toward the ranch house, where Vivian stood faintly visible behind the kitchen window, watching them both through the morning frost. I figured your mama might want peace again, he admitted. Oliver frowned slightly. She only looks peaceful when you are here. Children told the truth too easily. That was what made them dangerous. Before Elias could answer, the front door opened and Vivian stepped outside wrapped in a long cream-colored coat, her chestnut hair moving softly beneath the cold prairie wind. Snowflakes caught against her lashes while she crossed the yard toward them. She looked tired still, but not the same kind of tired. Less like a woman drowning. More like someone finally standing on solid ground after years at sea. Oliver quietly retreated back toward the house, leaving them alone beside the frozen well. For a moment neither spoke. The silence between them no longer felt sharp, just honest. Vivian looked down at the pendant resting in Elias's hand. Charles gave that back to me before he died, she said softly. He knew the truth long before anyone else did. Elias frowned slightly. He knew Oliver was mine? Vivian nodded. He said love mattered more than blood if a man chose kindness anyway. Snow continued falling around them in slow white spirals while those words settled deep inside Elias's chest. He glanced toward the ranch house. Sounds like he was a better man than most. Vivian smiled faintly for the first time in years. Real this time. Warm enough to reach her eyes. He was lonely too. Elias lowered his gaze. Briefly toward the snow beneath his boots. I should have come back sooner. I know. I searched for you. I know that too. He looked up slowly. Then why does it still feel like I lost 7 years? Vivian stepped closer until only inches separated them beneath the cold Wyoming sky. Because we did. Her voice trembled softly beneath the winter air. But Elias, surviving is not the same thing as living. The wind moved gently through the cottonwood trees near the river, while distant church bells echoed faintly from Dry Creek. Somewhere behind them, Oliver laughed inside the house at something the cook had said. Such a small sound. But it filled the empty spaces inside the ranch better than silence ever could. Vivian reached for Elias's rough, weathered hand carefully, like someone touching hope after years of fearing it would disappear again. I spent so long teaching myself not to wait for you, she whispered. Then you walked back into my life anyway. Elias held her hand tightly against the cold. I am tired of riding away from things that matter. Tears gathered briefly in Vivian's green eyes, though she smiled through them. Not broken, not frightened, just relieved. Behind them, the ranch doors suddenly opened again, and Oliver leaned halfway outside into the falling snow. Mama, he shouted happily. Breakfast is getting cold. Vivian laughed softly beneath her breath while Elias looked toward the boy standing in the doorway with snow gathering across his hair and the morning sun rising gold behind him. For the first time in years, the lonely cowboy understood something the frontier rarely taught men soon enough. Sometimes home was not a place waiting at the end of the trail. Sometimes home was simply the people who stayed when the storm finally passed.